short speedrun episode. Welcome to those watching on YouTube to another hopefully memorable episode of the speedrun. We will not be playing Nigel Short today, although he is welcome to be my next victim, or victimize me, as it were. Let's jump in. 10-minute game to start. Naha 11. Good luck to our opponent. And 1e4 on the board. c5. We face a Siciliano. And let's play our traditional Alapin. d5, he takes d5, main line. Queen takes d5. So as I've said before, we've kind of hit the level around 1650 where, you know, against most openings, people are going to start gravitating a little bit more toward the main lines, or at least to fairly reputable continuations. And the Alapin is no exception, d4. And at this point, black is, okay, knight c6, one of the two most popular continuations. The other one, of course, being knight f6, and quite frequently, the two of them blend into each other if black develops both knights. And our response does not change, at least initially. We start with knight f3, and now the big moment where black really chooses to set up. Because, okay, e5. So already a mistake. Already a mistake, and one of the many reasons that I like the Alapin is that it's not enough for black to know, oh, I just need to play d5. Now, a lot of people learn that, but then, you know, they play the obvious moves, and then they have no idea what to do in this position. And e5 is one of those kind of impulsive moves that you make if you're not too familiar with the theory. So it's actually quite instructive to observe how I react to this move. Because if you're seeing this move for the first time, what will be your reaction, your kind of instinct? So you should ask yourself that. What is your instinct here with white? What is your gut feeling about what we should do? Now, some of you might think, well, let's go c4 and drive this pawn to d5, because I've talked about that idea before. The problem with c4 is it allows an intermediate check on e4, right? So c4 is only a good move in the situation where black does not have a check on e4. Like if after we've played bishop e2, then c4 becomes a much more enticing possibility. So c4 actually is a serious mistake. The correct move here is actually just d takes e5. And this is a free pawn. And some people might say, I understand that it's a free pawn, but aren't we allowing an unfavorable queen trade? And isn't black going to start, you know, quickly getting their pieces out with a big initiative? And aren't we going to lose our pawn back? And all of that is an illusion. And this type of endgame happens very often in the Alapin, where we have to voluntarily recapture a queen on d1. And usually it's not as scary as it looks. Not nearly as scary as it looks. So here we have to be precise. And we have to figure out the right way to develop efficiently while preferably keeping the e5 pawn protected. Although in some situations, it might not be the worst idea to give the e5 pawn away in return for, let's say, a very quick development of our pieces. So there's many good moves here, I think, for white. There's many ways that we could prosecute our advantage. I'm a big fan of the move bishop f4 because I think it checks off several boxes. It brings out a piece. It vacates a square for our king. And obviously, the main thing, it reinforces the e5 pawn. So we want to be very careful about the move king c2 here. I'm not saying it's always bad, but king c2 does, you know, run into bishop f5 check. And we certainly don't want our king to start getting tossed around by the black pieces, because even without the queens, we absolutely could get checkmated if we're not careful. So one, you know, you could make the case that it's wise to play king c2, provoke bishop f5, and then drop back to c1. But I actually think that's not really necessary. I think we can go king c1 directly because we're really not worried about bishop takes f3. We're not worried about that at all. Okay, f6. Our opponent helps us out by offering us to solidify our pawn advantage just by trading, essentially getting rid of our very own pawn target. We don't actually even have to play e takes f6. The more advanced players who watch this might be enticed by the move knight b2, but let's play simple. Let's play e takes f6. Simple chess. No need for us to reinvent the wheel. And I'd also draw your attention to the fact that the black king, its access to the b8 square is cut off. So anytime black plays bishop takes f3 and we recapture, we have this kind of Boden's mate type idea with bishop coming out to h3, and that can be totally devastating. This is one of the big downsides of pushing your c-pawn and then castling queenside. Knight takes f6. And here again, priorities, right? What is our priority? Our priority is development, right? Because we're already up a pawn and we have a great sort of, like, fundamentally our position is superior, we don't need to pile on with moves like knight to g5, which would only ask for trouble. Knight g5 allows rook d1 check. I don't want to calculate that. Maybe that's good for white. I don't care. It doesn't matter because we have a much simpler approach, which is just to play knight b to d2, connecting the knights, and we're one step away from completing our development. Now, where is this bishop going to go out to? Depends on black's move, but I think a case could be made for bishop c4. Maybe you're like thinking about eventually bringing the bishop to e6. I really like the Ruy Lopez move, bishop to b5, because it does create the serious positional threat of bishop takes c6. And one rule of thumb, particularly, let's say, for intermediate players, is there is an inverse relationship between the number of pieces on the board and the, let's say, the significance of pawn structure. All right, so let's stress test that assertion. In a pawn endgame, the pawn structure is one of the most important factors, right? If one side has 3 passed pawns and the other side has a bunch of pawn islands, you're completely winning. In the middle game, generally, as I've said many times, the pawn structure, while a factor without question, is rarely going to be the most significant factor. But with the queens off the board and king safety not as important, it becomes more important to start playing with an eye toward maintaining the overall health of your pawn structure as you move closer and closer to a pawn endgame. Right? So that kind of statement should make sense. Okay, bishop d6. So yeah, black offers a trade. In the absence of a much better move, I don't see a reason we shouldn't trade. Now, you might argue against that, saying, well, isn't this helping black like quickly bring their pieces into the game? Well, again, this would be a more significant argument in the middle game. Black is just like black doesn't have the firepower to generate any kind of meaningful attack. So there's no need for us to refrain from this trade. Now here again, we have many ways that we can continue. We have a piece that we still need to develop. We could throw in the move h3, although I actually think this would be a serious mistake because it allows this really nasty idea of bishop takes f3. And if we recapture with the knight, we allow black's knight to jump into e4. So we don't want to procrastinate here with our development. The only potentially pleasant alternative to bringing this bishop out, I think, is knight d2 to c4. Kind of using the awkwardness of this rook to get our knight to a good square. But even that, like, I really don't particularly fancy because it does hem in the bishop. I think bishop b5, just like we intended previously, is the wisest course of action. Yeah, bishop b5. If black plays a6, we already have some tactics. So black doubles on the d file. Now we want to maximize the potential of this trade. We don't just want to take on c6 blindly. We want to do it in the best possible version. So I think actually starting with knight c4 makes sense. Notice that the d1 square is now protected by our rook. If the rook moves back to d7, then of course we will take on c6. The less cooperative move that our opponent will probably play is rook to e6. But even there, bishop takes c6, I think looks quite appealing to me, apart from some other things that we could explore. So actually there is a better move, I think, after rook e6. Rook to d3 looks very wrong because this walks into just about every available tactical resource, but we actually have to choose which one we're going to carry out. So there's a little calculation that we have to do here, right? And it's important not to get overwhelmed like by the abundance of options that you have. Like, you just go through one by one, starting with the most forcing continuation. So what's the most forcing continuation here? It's actually not to move this knight from c4, which I know a lot of people will be enticed by, because that's very messy, right? Knight e5, like black can take, and then there's a check on d1 potentially. The most forcing is actually just to take the knight on c6. Black recaptures with the pawn, and then we have to decide which knight we put on e5. So the problem again with knight fe5 is that we do allow this very nasty check on d1. But what about bishop c6, bc, and then knight c to e5? So if the rook moves back to d6, Then we have a fork on f7. If the rook moves back to d5, the pawn on c6 falls. There's like more forks on the table. That looks delicious. That looks, honestly, that looks crushing. Yeah, knight c to e5. And black's rook just has nowhere to go. Now, if black plays bishop takes f3, you should ask yourself, can we get away with taking the rook on d3? Is that a good idea? Who can tell me? Like bishop takes f3, knight takes d3. Try to visualize the line in your head and ask yourself, do we keep our material advantage there? So that's a trick question, because I know a lot of you will be like, no, because Daniel asked me that question. That's not how I work. The answer is yes, because after bishop takes g2, we actually can slide the rook over to g1, counterattacking the bishop on g2. However, another good exercise, bishop takes f3, knight takes d3, bishop takes g2. What about rook h1 to d1? Is that an alternative, or does that allow something nasty? So that allows something nasty. It allows the bishop to slide back to f3. And if you can visualize this entire line along with me, you're in good shape. Rook d2, knight e4, and the rook runs out of squares. So I'll write this down so that I can show it on the board afterward. If you weren't able to visualize, that's okay. I will show this line afterward. Rook d6. After a long think, our opponent succumbs to the fork. We can play knight f7, and we win the game. Easy clap. Yeah, so here again, we have a pretty wide choice. In general, like if you can take one of the pieces, then you should. There's no need to procrastinate. If you want to be super fancy, you can play g takes f3. I don't want to be super fancy. I just want the extra exchange. So I'm going to play the slightly less accurate move. Knight to d5. Black should have tried rook to d3, but this would not have changed the essence of the position. Now, again, what's on the checklist? What is our priority in this position? Well, obviously, we would like to trade rooks. That would be like on the bucket list. But first and foremost, we need to connect our rooks. Like we need our rooks to actually enter the game. And this is far more important than, let's say, keeping the f3 pawn alive. So we're just going to play king c2. I think a lot of people would start running into trouble because they would see the threat of rook f6 and they'd go like rook like h4, rook h3, or rook d1, rook d3. You don't want to bend over backwards to defend a meaningless pawn, as you'll see. And also the best form of defense is attack. So what is the best way of protecting the f-pawn? Well, that's another one of those trick questions. You can't protect the f-pawn, but you can counterattack black's weaknesses trying to get your rooks active, which is exactly what we should do, rook hg1. Now, if you have an easy opportunity to defend a pawn, then you should, and here we do, rook g3. Right? For now, we're going to keep the rook on g3. Later on, we can reactivate the rook in many different ways. Let's get the other rook into the game, rook e1, keeping the knight restricted. Also, I'm noticing how weak these pawns are, and we can start deploying this rook and recruiting it to attack these completely undefended pawns on the queen side. Yeah. Black's king is overextended. If it runs to the other side, then we can infiltrate down the middle. Literally, I'm identifying a pawn target, attacking it, and winning it. That's all I'm doing. Rook a4. And that's it. The game is over. Now, did black defend resiliently? Not particularly, but it just shows you how fast these endgames can go down the drain for black. Okay, rook a7. And that's it. We can start pushing our passer. Or we can take this pawn. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, let's just take on h7. Why not? Yeah, I wish our opponent would resign here. c4, that doesn't do anything. Now let's start pushing. Let's continue pushing. And continue pushing. King b6, we push it to a7. It's a protected square. And once this rook leaves to stop the pawn. Okay, I don't see what this threatens. Let's just push. Check, king d1, or whatever. Doesn't even matter. You can also go king b1, king a2 like this. King d1. Now, as you probably know, there are some situations where there's like perpetual check. This is not one of those situations. You should be acquainted with the knight and the rook as a potential drawing mechanism. And you should be like vaguely acquainted with the various like techniques of perpetual. But like here, the rook is too close to the white king. And so black needs like 3 moves to set this up. Now, one of those mechanisms is if the black rook were on e2 in this position and it were black to move, the knight a2 check is one of those typical mechanisms. Here, this would still not lead to the desired result because we would be able to give up the queen for the knight and we would still be up a rook. But that's in general like the one thing you should remember. Yeah, he's stalling the clock. And by the way, this is... Now you can see the type of situation in which I just decided, okay, let me start looking at the opening. Because if I'm excited about teaching people something, I can't hold myself back. But I promise myself that on future episodes of the speedrun, I will never talk about the like fishing pole moment. But hopefully people can now see that like what hurt me the most about the people and the GMs who were like, well, you know, Daniel, I didn't know you were so like your barrier to entry was so low, like you were so ready to turn the engine on. I was like, what's so sad about that is I was just excited about teaching people something. Like it came from a desire to establish the truth of a position because I thought this was a huge teachable moment. And you know, for that to be like the smoking gun, it would just like hurt me so much. Every fiber of my being during the speedrun is dedicated to making each moment educational. I don't like it when my opponent stalls out, not because I care about those 5 minutes, but because I don't want people to be bored. I don't want my editor to have extra work. That's really the only reason. I apologize. Good game to our opponent, but please don't do that if you're losing. So let's see what happened in this game. Let me copy it in. So what I'll say is this. Our opponent played a distorted version of a legitimate line. Like if black wants to play the e5 variation, he has to take on d4 first. Black has to include this move. And now e5 is a legitimate line, actually one of the best lines against the Alapin. So what is the difference, right? You might ask. Like what if white plays d takes c5 here, which is not the recommended move. The recommended move here is knight to c3. And I've talked about this before. Now typically black plays bishop b4. White plays bishop d2. Black has to give up the bishop pair. And white is playing for like a very small advantage here after e4. But black can equalize with like, if he knows a bunch of theory. So it's always very instructive to compare. So if you look at this endgame, what is the difference between this endgame and the endgame with the addition of the pawns on c5 and c3? How big of a difference does it make in your opinion? And like, why does it make that level of difference? So I'll give you a second to think about that. So the correct answer is that it makes a huge difference. And you might say, well, I don't understand that because if we add the pawns to c5 and c3, right, as we did in the game, black's bishop is blocked in, but so is white's knight. Doesn't that counterbalance each other? Well, not really. That's not how it works. The power of the black bishop coming out is much more significant than the availability of the c3 square, which typically white doesn't even use anyway. So here after bishop g3, the position is about equal. It's just zeros according to the engine. If we play bishop f4, if we play the same way that we did in the game, black is going to be better, like long castle. And here we see another very important factor, right? After king c1, the c file is open. So in the long run, the white king is going to be far more exposed. So here, for instance, black plays knight g to e7, swinging the knight around to g6. And the c3 square is not good for anybody. Like, who cares? Yeah, you got to play knight c3. Congratulations. Takes, knight to g6. Black will win the pawn back on e5 with interest. Black is slightly better. So e5 is a mistake. D takes e5. Here, black is in serious trouble. Queen takes d1, king takes d1. And I'm looking at reference to see, yeah, there are some games in the database. Actually, quite a few. Bishop to g4, 355 games still in the database. So this is a line. Bishop f4 is correct. This is the main move. Now, most people here actually play knight g to e7. And it's worth knowing how white should react to this move, because white's correct move here is incredibly hard to find. White's correct move here is far from intuitive. Far from intuitive. What do you guys think white should play here? So not knight a3. There's only one move to get a big advantage. So it's not e6. E6 is an interesting suggestion, but it doesn't do anything. Like black can still castle and recapture the pawn. So bishop e2 would be sort of the well, this is, I think, the most popular move. I think bishop e2, yeah, bishop e2 is the most popular move, but it's not correct because of knight to g6. Now the bishop typically drops back, and black is able to castle queenside with check. So now the main move is knight b to d2, covering the check. And black can get some annoying play here with the move h5. Okay, white plays h3, black plays bishop takes f3. And after bishop takes f3, knight g takes e5, you might ask yourself, well, what is the significance of the move h5? The point is to cover the g4 square, like preventing in the future the bishop check to g4. And white is only a tiny bit better at best. So the correct move is actually h3. The correct move is actually h3. Now this looks ridiculous because you're actually encouraging black to take on f3 and play knight to g6. Isn't that what black wanted to do anyway? Well, not quite. Right here, you actually give this pawn away and you play for the initiative. You play bishop to e3. It's almost winning for white here, actually. So this should be very confusing to you. You should be sitting there thinking, like, winning? Like, what? What are you talking about? So let's say black castles, right? The white king parks itself on c2. So this is the first thing that you should appreciate is how safe white's king is. White's king is completely safe because of this pawn on c3. So black, of course, plays knight g takes e5, right? Material is equal. White brings the knight out to d2. And the reason black is in such trouble is more positional than tactical. The point is this. The knights are terrible. The black knight on c6 has no prospects. It's restricted by this pawn. The knight on e5 similarly has no prospects. And the light squares are super weak for black. Like once this knight is chased away, the bishop can come out to c4. Black's only remaining bishop is totally hemmed in by the pawn. So the only thing working to black's advantage is this like visually deficient pawn structure, but it's really not such a big deal with so many pieces on the board. Okay, so how could the game develop? Let's try to understand how the game could develop. There's two games in the database. One guy played f7, f5 here. White responded with f4, chasing away the knight. Black went knight d7. This is a 2300 against a 2000. Now white played knight to c4, bringing the knight to the best square. Black developed the bishop, bishop e7. Now white played bishop to g2, deploying the bishop to an excellent square. This is actually not accurate. According to the computer, the best move was h4, driving the pawn up to h5 and eventually isolating the pawn in f5. So for example, let's say black plays knight to b6. Now we drive the pawn up to h5. And this is a very important positional idea. Right? The point is to essentially isolate the pawn in f5. And now anytime black plays g6, after the trade, the g6 pawn will then become isolated. Okay? So for instance, like bishop e2, you can play a patient move, and then you bring the rook over to g1, piling up on the g6 pawn. So I would encourage people to really kind of dig around and analyze this position on your own. But actually, you need to play for the bishop pair here with white and give the pawn back voluntarily. Really, really instructive and high-level idea. I want to see if I can find this one idea that's kind of cool. So this is just one example that I found of this concept that we just observed with the move a4. How should white convert the extra pawn? What is the best way to... Well, obviously, black is threatening checkmate. White is up a pawn. What is the best way to make Luft in this example? And can you justify this with an explanation? So the correct move is g4. Excellent. What is the point? Why not like h3 or f3 or any other move? So the point is, again, isolating the weakness, right? Cutting off the lifeblood to the e4 pawn and preventing f5. So black played f5 anyway in the game, but white just takes f5. Black plays rook b5. Black is going to win the pawn back, but in return, white is going to go around and start hunting down the e4 pawn. Once the e4 pawn is eliminated, the d pawn becomes a passer, and black essentially cannot prevent its further progress. And black resigned. Okay, so if we go back to our speedrun analysis, you see the same type of concept at the end of this line, where we play h5, using our pawn to section off a particular weakness that we later want to attack, if that makes sense. Okay, so anyways, Sorry to go so deep, but after king to c1, black is already in very serious trouble. I think there isn't much I have to say after f6. I just wanted to show one other line. Okay, so I think I explained everything here. The one line I wanted to show is after bishop takes f3, knight takes d3, black may appear to have this intermediate move, bishop takes g2. And now you have to find rook to g1, because if instead you play rook to d1, black steps back to f3 and the rook runs out of squares. Rook to d2, knight to e4, and white is suddenly in very serious trouble. So it is because of the resource rook to g1 that we can get away with taking the rook. And after we delivered the fork, the game is over. Not much else to say. If black had played rook to d5, we would have played knight takes c6 with a second extra pawn and potentially a third one on the horizon. So it just shows you the importance of subtleties in the opening, and that you should not fear the queen trade on d1 in many lines of the Alapin. As a matter of fact, I think after knight to f6, actually d takes c5 is white's main move. The Chessable course on the Alapin recommends dc, and it's the same thing. Black can take on d1, but it's not as big of a deal as it seems because we were able to cling to our extra pawn. Okay, one more 10-minute game. Okay, hopefully third time's the charm. Jewmamba, okay, great. We have the white pieces. And of course, we play the advanced French, which is my recommendation. Now, here, I don't actually recall if we faced the French before, but we faced it in previous speedruns, and those of you who've watched particularly diligently know that I really like this Steinitz variation, knight f3. Very little known variation at this level, even at the top level, not often studied. Very underrated line at the intermediate and early advanced levels. So the point is, you actually don't play c3. Right? You don't play c3, you prioritize the development of your minor pieces, essentially no matter what black does. And the way that black is playing it, our opponent does not realize the significance of what we're doing. I think our opponent thinks that we're going to play c3 anyway, but actually knight to c6 is a serious mistake. If you can believe that, this is already really bad for black. And the reason is actually that we play d takes c5. Okay, then we castle. And this construction, right, the queen on b6 and the bishop on c5 is actually incredibly vulnerable. Why is it incredibly vulnerable, and how do we emphasize its vulnerability with what move? Knight to c3, yes. And suddenly we have this massive positional threat, knight to a4, which black is ignoring. Black is ignoring this at his own peril. We play the move. Now, black doesn't lose a piece directly, but if any of you have ever played with the French or against the French, you know that dropping the dark squared bishop like this is suicidal positionally, because you're left with like the nightmare French bishop, and you cannot hand over a monopoly on the dark squares like this. You just can't. You can't afford that. So let me think for a second here, because in some situations we can do better than knight takes c5. You should at least invest a little thought into that. Let me think about this. So there. We might be able to win the game, like right off the bat here. Yeah, I think it's worth a try at least. So c3, yeah. So a lot of you are suggesting the move c3. And I think that c3 comes close to winning on the spot. But there is one tactic that you have to at least have calculated, which is the move knight c6 takes c5. At least some of you should have noticed this move, knight takes c5, exposing a discovery on the knight on a4. What is your response to that move? Now, I saw knight takes c5, and I think we have a way to disarm it quite nicely. So first of all, knight takes c5. Can we play knight takes c5 and win a piece? Well, no, because then black takes on f3 with check and picks up the knight on c5, and black emerges with an extra pawn. Now, some of you might say, well, what about b4? But b4 defeats the whole purpose of, like, ignores the threat, because the a4 knight is actually hanging after knight takes e5. So this is quite tricky. This is quite advanced. If I'm correct, of course. I don't know this theory. This is not like something I've studied before. But I'm pretty confident this wins for white. So my coach had a name for these types of tactical sequences that he would call boring tactics. Boring tactics are essentially ideas that you don't necessarily look for because we are so trained to look for puzzle rush type tactics that we often don't consider the simplest move because it's quote unquote too boring. But the reality is, in like non-puzzle rush chess, oftentimes the winning sequence isn't pretty and it isn't flashy, and you have to be okay with that. So knight to d8 by our opponent, which is probably the best that black can do, honestly, to not lose the game immediately. This hits the knight on a4, but you would agree with me, like, the version in which we've taken the bishop is so much better than doing it here. Like, we have included the moves c3, which is extremely helpful for us. It creates a potential stronghold on d4. We have forced black to play this insanely passive move, and so strategically, black is essentially lost. So how do we capitalize on our advantage? So I know a lot of you are probably aiming for bishop e3 here. I don't think that's the best move. I think the queen on c5 is something that we can use as an asset for us, right? And chasing it away immediately essentially cashes in our chips, right? It's like you've won the lottery and you're exchanging it for $5. By keeping the queen on c5, we are creating the long-term possibility of a move like bishop e3. And so I much prefer starting with knight d4, which is a concept that really a lot of people need work on. The threat is stronger than its execution. Let your opponent move the queen away on their own. This sets up massive threats like queen to g4, queen to h5, opens the gates for the f-pawn potentially to push forward, although that is rarely going to be the most effective plan. And of course, at some later point, we can play bishop to e3 and set up a discovered attack against the queen. So if I understand 1700s correctly, he might go knight c6. If I had to predict a move, I think knight c6 is likely. I'm not very good at predicting moves. It's not like I have done speedruns before. Let's see. Yeah, knight to g6 is also quite common and usually very innocuous because the knight on g6 is not a very threatening piece. Somebody asks, what was the move if he took e5? So I'll get to that after the game. I have to keep you entertained somehow. Yeah, so what would have been the move if black had played knight takes e5? Well, the move is knight takes e5, but that's just the beginning. That's like, okay, that doesn't tell you much. Okay, knight c6. Almost like this was prearranged. Hint, hint, wink, wink. No, just kidding. Okay. What do we do? Well, first of all, what does black want? Well, black wants to take on e5, and as a secondary concept, black wants to take our knight on d4. But the bigger threat, of course, is knight takes e5. So, of course, like, you might be looking at this queen, and can we, like, target the queen somehow? Maybe, like, b4? Nah, like, that's a stupid move. Not only because we hang c3, but because, like, the queen can always move back. So, maybe some of you are pining for knight b5. That's an interesting thought. But again, black can play knight takes e5. And in that position, maybe bishop e3 can be tried, but the queen can slide back to c6. Kind of a dead end. Now, a much better idea is to simply follow through on the main idea of the move knight to d4, which is that it opens up this pathway for the queen to join in the attack. And I think the simplest and strongest is just queen to g4, hitting g7, hitting where it hurts, trying to provoke more weaknesses on the dark squares. Our opponent totally ignores the danger, and now we have a very pleasant choice. We can play queen takes g7, but we don't have to. Now, in fact, I would not play queen takes g7 for two reasons. The first reason is that black can slide the queen back to f8, forcing the queen trade. But there is actually a far more advanced and far more annoying move. And if any of you spot it, I'll be pretty impressed. Black has a really annoying concept after queen takes g7, which is this move knight to f3 check. And the logic behind that is like, okay, I'm losing the knight anyway. Let me try to inflict the most structural damage while I give it away. It's a type of desperado. And then if you have to play gf, it's definitely not the best that we can do. Let's just play cd. Let's just play cd. Okay, so now black's king is stranded in the center, and we need to move to the next stage of attack. To optimize this attack, we need to find we need to maximize the role of this bishop. Well, to maximize the role of this bishop, we should ask ourselves, on what diagonal is it better placed? Well, it's definitely best placed on the a3, f8 diagonal, which is an idea you should be familiar with. What is the typical plan of like putting it there? Well, the typical plan is to play a4 and then b3 and then bishop to a3. Right? So let's do it. a4. You can also start with b3. You could argue that's more flexible because it also, like in an emergency scenario, you can bring the bishop up, but I don't think it matters. I think a4 is a sexy move because it keeps black guessing. Our opponent thinks that we're like going for queenside expansion, even though we're not. But instead, we're going for bishop a3. Awesome. Just notice how we're playing on all sides of the board. Bishop a3, forcing knight b4, essentially, or knight e7. And now we just continue keeping our foot on the gas pedal. What's an easy thing we can do to increase the pressure? Well, rook a1 should be completely natural to most people. Now, black is going to go bishop c6. And we're like 1 or 2 steps away from ending their sorry resistance. g6, okay, simply allowing the infiltration. Well, that makes it easy. Yeah, many roads lead to Rome after bishop c6, but this is just painful to look at. Painful to look at. Now, if we really want to rub it in and play like a Russian schoolboy, get every piece into the action. Rook fc1. Total control over the position. There is no hurry. You could also have played queen to g5. We can play queen to g5 now, preventing the bishop on d7 from moving by adding an attacker to the knight. I mean, look at this. This is why the French is a terrible opening. And sliding the queen into f6. And if we really want to accentuate it, bishop to d6 is nice. Why not? Just get all of the pieces to these squares. You could have played bishop takes g6. I know some of you saw this move, but then rook g7. And this is ridiculous. A ridiculous level of domination of the white pieces. I am a French hater, absolutely. h4. I'm really into this position. Just Zugzwang. Just Zugzwang. And now, okay, let's put black out of their misery. Let's play rook takes d7. I'm not even asking people to find the move here. It's too straightforward. Rook takes d7. One rook yields the path to the other. And here you can choose between winning the queen or winning the game, or both. Yeah, I will play rook takes e7, just aiming for fastest possible checkmate. Not so long ago, I showed you a game that I would say really is similar in many ways to how we won this one. It's like my mental association for games of this kind against the French. Does anybody know what game I'm referring to? So I have this game in its original annotations. It's Alekhine versus Nimzowitsch. Alekhine versus Nimzowitsch. So I'll actually start with that game. GG to our opponent. Alekhine Nimzowitsch. This game was played in San Remo, Spain, I think, January 1930. This is an original edition of Alekhine's Best Games. From the year My Best Games of Chess, Alexander Alekhine, New York, 1939. Okay, so let's read Alekhine's original commentary. Alekhine Nimzowitsch. e4, e6, d4, d5. Alekhine played knight c3. Nimzowitsch played bishop b4. This is the win hour. e5, c5, bishop to d2. This rather tame move, in connection with the following knight maneuver, should not cause black much trouble. More promising, perhaps only because less explored, is queen to g4 or even pawn takes pawn. That didn't age very well. The main move now is a3, of course. So let me skip through the opening because that's not the interesting phase. Knight to e7, knight to b5, bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, short castle. And after Alekhine plays c3, you get sort of the advanced pawn formation, right? It's in Italy, I apologize. Pawn to queen, knight 3. Alekhine writes, the wish to solve the queen-bishop problem as rapidly as possible is, by black and the French, quite legitimate. But in this particular position, the attempt will prove a failure, as black cannot succeed in exchanging that bishop against white's bishop. Good instead was the move knight to f5 exclam, preventing knight to d6, as played with success by Nimzowitsch against Dr. Lasker 4 years later in Zurich. Sure. Alekhine plays f4, and Nimzowitsch played bishop to a6, trying to force white's a pawn up in order to play afterwards. Knight to queen bishop 3. Oh, he's trying to force a4 to play knight c6, knight a5. But as we will see, the second part of this plan cannot be executed. Alekhine plays here. Nimzowitsch plays queen d7, a4, knight to c6, b4 exclam. Strangely enough, this more or less conventional move, created at the time of the game a kind of small sensation. The late Dr. Tarash, for instance, called it in his comments highly original. To my mind, more surprising than the move is the fact that a player of Nimzowicz's level, when adopting the plan starting by b6, did not take this possibility into serious consideration. Damn. So flaming Nimzowitsch, great. Pawn takes b4, pawn takes b4, bishop to b7, knight to d6. You can see that Alekhine is winding his tentacles around black's position. Pawn to f5, question mark. The decisive error in an already bad position. In view of the threatening advance of white's a pawn, the only chance of obtaining more counterplay lay in a5. The point being, if b5, then knight b4. So Alekhine was intending bishop to b5, short castles, after which white's initiative would not develop so rapidly. Instead, Nimzowitsch plays this terrible move f5, allowing Alekhine to advance his pawn further, cramping black's position. And just watch how the game ends. Knight to c8, knight takes b7, queen takes b7, a6, queen to f7, bishop to b5, every move with tempo, knight to e7, short castles, pawn to h6. Although knight g5 was not yet a threat, it could become one in the near future. Black has nothing better to do. King is rook to c1, rook f c8, rook to c2. Alekhine doubles on the c file, and the game is over. Queen to e8, rook queen's rook to bishop 1. This and the next move are not the most exact ones, but it doesn't matter. Queen's rook to knight 1, queen to e3, rook to c7, rook to c3. Alekhine builds the Alekhine gun. Queen to d7, rook to c2. Just look at this. King to f8, queen to c1, rook to c8. And we get the position that I thought about during our game. Just look at the pressure on the knight on c6. And Alekhine's next move is super sexy. Bang! Bishop a4. Preparing the move b5. The last link of the positional attack started by my 15th move, which was a5. Incredible. In order to save the piece threatened by b5, black must sacrifice the b-pawn. After this, he succeeds in protecting the important squares with the king, but must still resign as a consequence of a complete Zugzwang. An instructive finish, says Alekhine. b5, bishop takes b5, king to e8, bishop simply moves back, king d8, h4. After a couple of irrelevant pawn moves, black will be obliged to play queen to e8, after which b5 wins immediately, because the rook on c7 has lost a defender. And Nimzowitsch resigned in this position. Okay, so this is a classic game that's often shown to, like, you know, it was shown in the old days by, like, the Soviet-minded coaches, and our game reminded me of it for some reason. I hope you enjoyed it. Funnily enough, we play this is called the Nimzowitsch system. So Nimzowitsch played this with white as well. Queen to b6, bishop to d3, and we don't have the time to delve into, like, a deep exposition of the theory, but who can tell me, like, after c takes d4, what is the point of white's setup? There's other speedrun games where we face c takes d4, but what is it that white is aiming for here in this line? So the wrong answer is knight takes d4. You're not trying to win the pawn back. This is formally a gambit line, and that's important to understand. You're not playing knight takes d4. You are actually castling kingside. You're castling kingside. What you are aiming for is essentially to overprotect the e5 pawn, which has the influence of cramping black's development to such an extent that it's very difficult for black to like properly get their pieces out. Okay, so this is like the positional underpinning of this line. Of course, like if you're a French player, you know that black often can get away with the move f6, but here f6 is very dangerous because black is quite underdeveloped. So like usually what happens is black will play knight c6. We will play the rook to e1 to make sure this pawn is super well protected, and black will start running into troubles getting the rest of their minor pieces out. And I'm sure we'll have more of a chance to play this line in the future. Of course, like if black plays bishop to c5 here, then the knight comes out to d2, and much like in the game, if black plays knight g to e7, the bishop on c5 runs into a lot of trouble after the move a3, threatening b4 and threatening knight to b3. So, in fact, black is already like borderline lost. Black can play a5, but then we play knight to b3. This bishop is going to be traded, and black also cannot castle kingside to make matters worse because obviously there is a classic Greek gift sacrifice. So really exciting line. I like it a lot. In the game, black plays short castles and knight bishop to d7, knight to c3. And I would argue that knight ge7 is already a decisive mistake. Already a decisive mistake. Allowing knight e4 is unthinkable. What should black have done instead? Probably something like knight to d4, or even moving the queen back. So queen a5, c3. And the one thing I wanted to focus on is showing you what I intended after knight takes e5. So here my intended move was knight takes e5. And the first thing to understand is what is our response to bishop takes a4? Who can tell me where the queen should go? This is a difficult question, actually, because there's only one correct square for the queen. So first of all, the move b3 is wrong because it allows queen takes e3. Don't do that. So it's not queen f3. This is the hard part. It's not queen f3 because black can castle kingside. And if white now plays b4, the black queen drops back to c7, hitting the knight, and black is okay. It's also not queen h5 because here the queen is just tossed back with g6. The correct move is queen to g4. This is the correct move. What is the difference? Well, the difference is this. You are threatening the pawn on g7, and if black castles, you play b4. Black still has queen c7, but at the end of the line, the bishop hangs. At the end of the line, the bishop hangs. And still, it's not the end. Black can play queen takes c3. There's a fork. And now white has a beautiful move. Who can find the most clinical, the most accurate response for white? Who can tell me the move? Not bishop h7, not queen g4. The move is queen to a3. Queen to a3, folks. And the point here is a very typical one. Bishop to b2 will simply trap the queen on a1. You might be used to queen c2 being a more typical way to do that. And this also works. Bishop b2, queen a2, and rook a1 also wins the game. But queen a3 is really pretty because it also keeps like everything under control. So that's a simple line that justifies the move knight takes e5. And I haven't even talked about queen takes a4. Haven't even talked about queen takes a4. Here, I didn't have like a clear move in mind, but the computer shows that queen h5 is incredibly powerful for white. g6, queen to g5, and black is like collapsing. Black has no moves. Because if black castles, you simply play b3, and the bishop on d7 will be lost. And if black is not castling, like just queen f6 is coming, everything is hanging, black has no way to keep the game going. So this is what like high-level tactics actually look like. If you're playing a game and you're not sure, of course, there was nothing wrong with taking and then playing c3. Like, this is also a big advantage. So in any case, black played knight d8. Now we demonstrated some patience. Queen to g4, really instructive move that I want you to really make sure you understand. And here, I really like this moment where I didn't rush with queen takes g7, because this would have allowed either a queen trade or knight f3 check followed by queen f8, which is quite kind of nasty. And some of you might draw a parallel in your mind between this and the Morphy opera game, right? In the opera game, there was a moment where Morphy plays queen b3 with a fork. Morphy's opponents play queen to e7, and you might remember that Morphy did not take this pawn because it allowed a queen trade, and even though white is much better, Morphy believed that he could squeeze more out of the position, and he was right, so he played knight c3. So don't like rush to make the obvious move, especially if it gives your opponent like a chance to trade queens in a situation where you think you can play for checkmate. You have to make that judgment call on a case-by-case basis. So we just decided to take back. The queen drops back to f8, preventing black from castling, and now we execute this classic plan with bishop to a3, which is completely devastating. And the rest, I think, you can review at your own leisure. But I won't embarrass my opponent by showing this for too much time. And that's where we'll end, guys. We only got 2 games in today, but I think they were pretty instructive. I'm pretty tired. It's been a long stream. So we'll pause this episode for tonight. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys later. I will try to stream tomorrow, but no guarantees. But I'm going to head out for tonight. Thanks for hanging out today, guys. I'll see you guys later.